She's a published author with 3 books to her name. I'm delighted to welcome Irial to the Junior Business Studio. Hi, Irial.
Hi, Alec. How are you?
I'm brilliant, thanks. How are you keeping in all COVID and all of these things?
I'm surviving.
Surviving
Yes.
and thriving. Good stuff. Listen, you know the routine. I'm going to take you back to your school days, but I'm afraid that's just the way it works. So tell me, were you the academic, were you the person who was screaming to get out and wanted to travel? Where did you fit within the whole process?
I think I fitted in with the acquiescing to the whole education system, and I had to do it. I had to get on with it, and sure, I just keep the head down and say not a lot. I think was
All right.
a good summary of my second level career.
I hear from a lot of my guests that the most common thing on their school report would have been, could have done better. Would that have fitted with you?
That would have summed it up perfectly. Yeah.
All right. But I mean, you were going to head off to college. So tell me what you had in your mind or what sort of ambitions you had there.
Yeah, so I think because everybody else was going to college, likewise, I was going to go. And when it came to filling out the CAO form, I was thinking I did biology for the Leaving Cert. So I liked biology, thought I liked science. And so I was going to do something in the science area. And when it came to filled out the form, and they say put your top choice first and then work your way down and see how you get on. And so by the time I got on, I had about my 6th choice, which was a applied science in physics, chemistry, and maths.
All right.
Yeah, so I had an honor in pass maths and an honor in biology. And I headed into physics and maths. So first year was a little rocky, it has to be said. And I have to also say I never really got my head around chemistry. So thankfully I failed first year and repeated it. Focused me. I'd never failed it, for all I could have done better. I never failed at anything either in secondary school. So this is the first time I actually failed something. I was like, oh, don't like the feeling of this. So it was head down. And, when I got through first year, I gave up the chemistry and focused in on physics and maths.
All right, 2 interesting subjects. I'm sure they're going to lead you to somewhere else, but had you something else in mind that you were going to head off into?
Yeah, I think when I coming towards the end of it, it was, what do you do with the degree in physics and maths? And so for me, the most practical and relevant to the business world was one of the subjects I'd done in maths was statistics. So I decided I'd do a postgraduate in statistics out in UCD. So I did that, and the idea was, my father used to say, well, when are you ever going to use that degree? The first port of call was I was going off traveling. I mean, that was really where my first aim in life was to go off traveling. And my sister lived in Australia, so I was going off to visit her via a green card in America. So I'd gotten a green card, took it up for the summer, went to Australia, got into financial services there with the maths, and then moved back to Boston.
How did you find the experience of Australia and then moving on to the States? I mean, obviously 2 different cultures, but you're in the same sort of industry. How did you find this sort of dynamics of both?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, the Americans are sort of, there's a friendliness and there's a, warmth to them. Initially, when you meet them, the Australians can be need to get to know you a bit. So that was quite different. You could kind of see the differences in the cultures, and you were trying to figure out the differences and then figure out how they were different to the Irish culture as well. So I suppose that sort of understanding that we all have, as humans, we all have the same basic needs, but how societies set up the achievement of those needs can be very different, and then that shows up in the workplace as well.
I mean, it's often been said to me that the Americans can be very cold in the sense that business is business, and really, while the friendly face is at the front of it, the dagger is often quite behind it.
Well, they're more the trust is based on what tasks and what gets done. So when I worked in Boston, we used to calculate what's called the NAV. So basically it was the price of mutual funds, and every day that would get calculated. And basically it was said, you're only as good as your last nav. So, if you got that one wrong, you didn't want to know. But if you got it right, it was like, yeah, you're doing a great job.
All right.
So it was very much based on, trust is based on the task getting done correctly.
Certainly, from just talking to you before the interview, I gather you seem to be a place that when you move into it, people want to take it over or merge with it. So this was to happen in the States.
It was, it was, yes. Yeah, I worked for a company called Scudder, Stevens and Clark, and it merged with a company up in Chicago. And so as part of that merger, our business unit had to be redesigned because we had two very different models. So I was one of two internal people who were asked to work with the external consultants back when in PwC, when it was just barely PwC, that they were still talking in terms of, were you a Price Waterhouse or were you a Cooper and Lybrand person? So they were. So that we kind of worked through the organization design of how the future organization of the business unit was going to work. So that was really, really interesting because it brought out when you go into a big organization, you're working within the constraints and within the processes and within the culture that's already been established. So you don't really think about how it's been established or how did it come about. When you do an org design project, you realize it's actually, that there's ways that you can design the outcomes, or you can design them in a way to increase the likelihood that you're going to get those outcomes. So that was a really, really interesting, was an amazing opportunity to get to see that so early in my career, particularly as I had a couple of years of management experience at that stage, but to kind of see how actually, how you design the process or whatever really does have an impact on the performance of the business.
Right. Just from, I suppose a lot of our business would be SME business owners as well. Is there much relevance to that sort of planning for them?
There is, and particularly, there is for two reasons. One, if you're a small business and things aren't going in the way that you want them to, repeat patterns or repeat kind of, why does that situation keep arising? It's often because there was no conscious decision of how we were going to design the process. So it happened because somebody, whoever started it off or whatever, went, this is, I think, the best way to do it. And it might have been for that initial instance, and then that becomes the way it gets done without ever thinking about, well, what are all it worked for that situation, but will it work for all the different various options that might happen in that process, or the different situations that might happen in that process? And so we can end up with these processes in place that maybe weren't really particularly thought of. But yet we get certain outcomes, they deliver certain outcomes. But the other, where it becomes also really important for SMEs, is when they're growing. So when you're growing into, taking on, you might be going from 5 people to 10 people or 10 people to 20 people. A lot of the processes are in people's heads to start with, but the process that you had there isn't necessarily the process that's going to be appropriate with 20 people. And so you end up, as you bring more people in and the process isn't working, it's that understanding of, actually, it's not the person necessarily, it's the process that they're executing that's actually causing the problem. And being able to differentiate between the person who's doing the job and the actual process that they're operating is really, really important, because sometimes we end up with, it's, why does everybody have a problem with that process? And it's all of a sudden it's going, well, it's actually not the person, it's the actual process needs to be revised. So understanding that actually there's two parts to it. It's the system and there's the ability to operate the system, even for small businesses, is really important.
It's interesting, even large organizations so often have these sort of legacy processes and systems that they seem reluctant to abandon, despite their best efforts.
Yes. Yeah, and that's, some of that is that, well, that's getting into the change side of things, that you can have people who've been there a while and they like doing that and they like the way it was done and they don't want to change it, and they're out of their comfort zone by changing. And so then even when we try to change the process and try to introduce new processes, people will end up you're holding on to what they know and what they're comfortable what they're comfortable with, and then that impedes the ability to change to the new process.
I was saying to you earlier that in the sort of course that you've taken through your life, that there's a certain sense of predictability around it, from statistics to where you were, and that must form part of your mindset, but also help you in terms of designing these systems for people.
Yes, and I think there's two things. One, I think this is where the science came out, was the system. So I look at everything in systems. So my son plays soccer, and I look at the system of the soccer pitch as opposed to the. I'm going, oh right, right. You're in defence. You're you're forward. Okay, what are you doing in midfield? Like, so I look at it through the eyes of the system, but also the ability to see the patterns,
Right.
and to be able to make sense of the patterns, and to be able to say, okay, there's that pattern again. What does that mean? What does that mean to the system? Why do we keep getting that? So it's I think that is that ability to kind of step back and go, what's really happening? That generifying it as opposed to the specific, and seeing the pattern from the generic.
I suppose the real sort of spanner in the works for you must be human behavior, because while everything else can be predictable, that usually isn't.
Yeah, you'd think that, wouldn't you? I'm fascinated by the human, absolutely fascinated by the human and how they show up in work. And I think it could be that combination of getting the systems and seeing the patterns, and that fascination with the human, which is the combination is quite unique. Because I like, when I come back to Australia, I was fascinated with two bosses, and one everybody loved, and the other everybody was sort of, yeah, can I go into the other boss's team, please? And I was fascinated with what they both did and how they approached management differently and how people responded.
Right.
And I thought that was a bit of a blip. I just thought it was a bit of a blip because I was on my year off. But it turned out to be, it's been an ongoing, lifelong passion as to figuring out what makes people tick. And again, you bring in the systems into that. So the systems of, emotional intelligence, personality, preferences, values, all of those systems, even the cultural systems of the different cultures people grow up in, and they're all systems. And while you don't necessarily, you can't say it's, if you're like this, you must be, if you like X, Y, and Z, you must be A. It's not as definite as that, but it's, you're in that space of A. And how does that show up in the workplace? So even though you're dealing with different people and there is that unpredictability, there is still a level of predictability actually around what you would how you expect different levels of emotional intelligence, different values, different personality preferences to show up. So actually it works a lot better than you would intuitively think.
Yes, and because I can often see you can have two people who seem perfectly normal, sane, rational people, and bring them together, and you have a cauldron bubbling away there.
Yeah. And yet there will be there'll be reasons for it. You'll be able to actually kind of, there'll be something that rubs up between the two of them that you're actually able to kind of go, actually, because of that, that's what's causing the friction there between them.
Anyway, you weren't to spend all of your life abroad. You were to come back to Ireland. So what were you going to get involved in here?
Yeah, so when I originally came back, I was originally going to do an MBA. So I had been accepted to both UCD and Trinity to do the MBA. And then because in the US, the MBA was huge, it was, everybody talked about doing an MBA. And then I kind of thought about it and I thought, well, is that really the right move, or would I be better off because getting a job in the funds industry because it was so huge? So when I originally moved back, I moved back as operations manager. And then about 6 months in, there was the realization that the funds industry had exploded in the previous kind of 2 to 3 years. And there was a huge amount of business and not an awful lot of people who knew how to do the work of the business. So I ended up moving into training.
All right.
So I had put together a couple of training courses over in Boston. So I kind of was like, okay, kind of like this a bit. And so did about 6 months in technical training, and then moved into that whole management development the recruitment, the interviewing skills, those sorts of training courses. But we actually grew the training team from myself and one training room up to a team of about 6 and 3 training rooms. So it became very embedded into the culture of the organization and became a key enabler of the organization. So they strategically, they decided to move into hedge funds, and they were able to go, right, we have this asset of training and development where they can enable the people to be able to do the work, and that builds our credibility with future clients. So they really saw the training as a key enabler of the business growth.
Well, one of the things I've been reading fairly much is there's a real challenge around training in this sort of modern day and age, particularly around technology. I don't know whether you've seen sort of huge gaps appearing there.
Yeah, I think there is I don't know whether, I think it's an interesting question, because I do think there is gaps, and I think there's I don't think companies are investing in it as much as they did before, but also the work that we do has become so much more complex, and it's so much more part of what goes on in our heads. It's so knowledge based, and that it's an awful lot harder to articulate what is it that I do and how do I share that with you and how do I get that knowledge out there to another person to be able to do what I do. So I think it's the seeing training as important and investing in it, but it's also the articulation and the extraction of the knowledge to be able to train other people, I think, has got more complex as well.
In terms of what you're doing at the moment, we'll come on to the books in a minute, because the fact that you've 3 of them under your belt suggests that you have a certain predictability about your consistency of writing. So that's a good start. But in terms of, you're working with companies across different industries. Are they all sort of financially related, or are they totally different altogether?
They are totally different. My very first client after leaving the funds was in the funds industry, but one of the things I had intentionally done was to try and get clients in other industries, and I am so glad I did, because that was prior to 2008.
All right.
Yeah. So that one client who I'd had quite a while, I no longer had after 2008, but I had branched out into engineering. So I would have gone into engineering, working with manufacturing, engineering, and then into services like professional services, legal, accounting, consulting companies, and then moving into the medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and even into the marketing and the print world, that type of those.
All right.
Types
that's
of
quite
industries.
interesting.
Yeah. Then not-for-profit as well. I've put quite a bit of experience in not-for-profit as well.
And typically, what sort of size organization are you working with these days?
I've worked kind of with big companies, big organizations, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, right down to kind of 10, 12 people, small companies. I think I'm concluding that in some of my services, I definitely love working with the smaller, medium, small companies, because you can make such a huge difference. You can really make a big change in how they look at things, how they plan for things, how they clarifying their strategy and the performance challenges that they have. You're working so closely with the owners and that as well, that I really love that.
Yeah, no, it's quite interesting. I suppose if we were to take in sort of COVID, for example, and the challenge that's presented over about the last year and a half plus, the ability of the SME to adapt, I think, has been quite phenomenal.
Yeah, and some amazing, really innovative things that they've done to kind of pivot their business and move it online, and how they've thought about it has been great.
What sort of challenges were presented to you over COVID? I mean, obviously not including going out and visiting people, but how have you managed it all?
Yeah, I think initially it was that everything shut down, because I had work lined up that was in the middle of doing your coaching programs, things like that, and it sort of in the initial days, months, it kind of all closed up, which was, to me, I took it as the opportunity to, I suppose, reimagine the business and also to write my next book. So that was book number 2 came out. I started focusing in on that, took the opportunity, and then then it was around the I suppose the networking challenge and the
Right.
how do you network, how do you get your name out there, how do you kind of connect with potential business clients, that type of thing. So that was yeah, a definite need to reimagine that. And then it's the I think of doing the book that really opened my eyes to that whole online digital world in a totally different way than I had really been thinking about it previously. So at the moment, so over the last kind of year, I'm in the process of sort of building that out and moving towards those
All
ideas,
right.
putting those
Sort of.
ideas into practice.
That should be an interesting challenge, and we'll keep an eye on that space.
Yeah.
Tell us about your latest book, which is due to come out.
Yes, so the latest book is, which was this year's book project, is The Manager's Dilemma: How to Empower Your Team's Problem Solving. And I suppose a bit like what we talked about, the training and the knowledge piece around how do you get people to be able to sort things out and problem solve? How do you develop somebody else's problem solving? So a lot of times managers and business owners, they tend to be very good at problem solving. They have a natural tendency, natural ability to problem solve. But how do you actually get somebody else? How do you develop somebody else's problem solving?
Right.
And this was an issue I kind of came across years ago when I was managing the training team. I had somebody who was coming to me and asking me something. I was looking at them going, you know the answer to this question. Why are you asking me? And that, I kind of gave her the answer, sort of thought about it, and the next time it arose, I had a different approach to how I was going to deal with it. Didn't really think an awful lot about it, and then several years later I was mentoring a team, a group of people, and they were kind of describing the same sorts of patterns that I had experienced.
Right.
And I kind of thought, well, okay, I'll throw this out and threw it out. And so it was I suppose the challenge is, if you're very good at problem solving and somebody brings you a problem, what do you tend to do? You tend to solve it.
Right.
But you're not enabling the person to solve their own problems or help them develop the process of understanding and how to solve it themselves, and the knowledge that they might need to properly solve it. And so that's what the book is about. It's around how do you actually step back and actually, design out the coaching process around how you would coach them to get to that point that they're able to solve the problems themselves. But also it does take a look at the manager themselves, or the business owner themselves, and looks at how, do I like solving, do I like being in the middle of the firefighting, do I like kind of getting the rewards of solving the problem or whatever, and how that plays into the dynamic that happens. So again, getting back to the patterns here, Alec.
Yeah.
Seeing the patterns and going,
yeah, you're predictable, Irial. That's what we can say. That's good. And what are the
word said about me before, Alec?
There we go. Well, I take it as a compliment. I think. Well, certainly, if you're in business training, they want somebody who's predictable with the outcomes.
I suppose. Yeah, that's true.
It's interesting because what you'll see, particularly in SME type companies, where somebody comes to the owner with a problem, they'll go, sure, give it to me here. I'll do it myself, because I'll have it done quicker than it take me to show you how to do it.
And that's exactly it. And it gets into that whole, and I kind of address some of that thing that if the business owner is doing it and it's taking them half an hour, but the cost to them of half an hour of their time versus, an hour of somebody else more junior, over time that builds up. And if you calculate it out or whatever, it puts and again, going back to the system of the company, it puts pressure on your pricing, because you priced it at it being doing at a more junior level. It puts pressure on the system, because that's half an hour of the business owner's time that isn't going into developing the business, attracting new business, whatever it is they should be doing. So the whole thing starts getting out of kilter. And so that's part of what the book is about, is to go, there is a way you can actually bring it back into kilter and get the work done at the right levels, because otherwise the whole system goes out of whack, and it starts putting pressure, and then everybody starts getting the emotional intelligence starts kicking, everybody starts getting a bit antsy and a bit ratty. And so
just speak for a moment about emotional intelligence. I mean, we've about 2 minutes left. Give us about 30 seconds on emotional intelligence.
Well, emotional intelligence is really the intelligence that arises out of being able to recognize and read our emotions and other people's emotions. So if you can start feeling the emotions, they show up in our body. So it's around
Right.
understanding where is this emotion showing up in my body, and being able to recognize that and go, what's the name of the emotion and what's triggering the emotion? And then you can start dealing with the underlying cause of the emotion, as opposed to people with low emotional intelligence just react to the emotion.
So they've
So
no
it's that
filter on
difference.
them.
They have no filter, yeah. Particularly if they've got low impulse control, they just, you know, they just allow their emotion overtake them, as opposed to kind of saying, okay, let me step back. You know, there's an emotion showing up here somewhere. What is it? Why is it? Okay, what's wrong with that situation? What do I not like? And then using that information to act in an appropriate way. So the more emotionally intelligent we are, the more we can read ourselves, the more we can read other people's emotions, and the more we can have more productive relationships with people.
And be able to put on our own filter.
Yes.
Just remind our listeners about the name of the book again and when it's going to be available.
Yep. So the book is The Manager's Dilemma: How to Empower Your Team's Problem Solving. And it will be available on Amazon from Sunday, the 12th of September.
Fantastic. So don't forget to go out there and grab your copy of that.
Yes.
Where can people find out more about you, Irial?
You can find out more about me going to evolutionconsulting.ie.